In this multi-part series, we will look at the Christian argument. Our goal is to systematically prove that the Christian worldview is the correct one. In part 1 of the series, we will discuss practical philosophy, defining terms, and providing a structure for our argument. In section A, we will discuss argumentation, that is, what an argument is, and how to argue. This will allow us to frame our argument systematically. First, let us define two terms. Reasonable is a characteristic denoting dependently logical, while rational is a characteristic denoting independently logical. Take for instance the proposition, dogs have 4 legs. In general, the sentence is rational because most people understand the concepts of dogs and legs and what it means to have legs. Therefore, it does not depend on anyone's understanding of these concepts in order to understand the claim that dogs have 4 legs. However, if we met someone who did not understand what we meant by dog or leg, or the concept of having a leg, then this statement can only be reasonable because it depends on what we mean, or what they understand to be a dog or leg, or the concept of having a leg. Therefore, we understand that all rational claims are only conditionally rational, conditional on the basis that the presenter and the hearer of the statement understand and agree on what is being stated. Now we want to understand the basic argument. An argument has 3 parts: the presuppositions, the body, and the conclusion. The presuppositions, or premises, are what are being assumed in order to make the argument. The body is the step-by-step working out of the argument from the presuppositions towards some goal. The goal is obviously the conclusion, which is the summary statement of the entire argument, what is necessary so that the conclusion of an argument is taken to be true. We should notice that the presuppositions must be true, and the body and conclusion must be rational, where the condition being met is the agreement in the truth of the presupposition. However, any argument that would have the presuppositions of one argument as its conclusion would itself have a set of presuppositions that would need to be shown to be true. This recursive result implies that no argument can ever be shown to be true. Instead, the true argument is an ideal. In other words, all presuppositions are equally unprovable. What about a good argument then? Surely there is at least a measure for a good argument. If you notice, the only difference between a true argument and a good argument is the status of the presuppositions. Instead of true presuppositions, a good argument will have reasonable presuppositions, where the logical dependence comes from whether the presupposition makes more or less sense. For instance, if you came home, and your front door was found ajar, and many of your belongings had been stolen, does this make more or less sense that aliens stole your belongings? You might be able to build a rational case that aliens stole your belongings, but more often than not it certainly seems more reasonable to believe that humans broke into your house and made off with your stuff. We will first look at rational argumentation. A rational argument is an argument that claims that from our premises, we can conclude our conclusion. In other words, it is the logical, step-by-step bridge between the premises and the conclusion. Because of the nature of rational argumentation, it strictly avoids logical fallacies, which by definition are steps which do not directly follow one another. There are many classifications of logical fallacies, but every logical fallacy is a non sequitur, which is Latin for it does not follow. There are 2 key ways to rationally argue, the argument and the counter-argument. Both have advantages and disadvantages, which I have shown. The argument is simply making the case that your position is rational, while the counter-argument is making the claim that others' positions are not rational. Now we will look at reasonable argumentation. When we will refer to reasoning, we will not be talking about the entirety of logic. Instead, we will be speaking only of reasonable argumentation, which is an argument for a specific presupposition. Reasoning claims that some premise is better or more reasonable than its alternative. You will notice that while rational arguments strictly avoid logical fallacies, reasonable argumentation cannot. Take, for example, the common practice of using quotations to support your argument. Often this is referred to as the logical fallacy of quote mining. And it is true that if you used quotations as a logical step in a rational argument, then your argument would in fact be irrational. However, if we are in the position of establishing whether a given premise is more or less reasonable, then quotes from people knowledgeable in that field might make the case. This, of course, does not prove that the premise is objectively reasonable, but we also know that no argument ever could. Therefore, this is the next best thing. Notice also that there was a qualifier to the logical fallacy. When I used it as a reasonable argument, the person being quoted needed to be one with knowledge or expertise in the field in question. This is actually what allows the logical fallacy to work in a reasonable argument, because the qualifying statement is designed to be something your opponent presupposes as true, at least within the boundaries of your argument. Another quick example might be understanding why you trust a professor to teach you accurate information. Certainly any argument you give will contain logical fallacies, and so is rationally refutable. But we are not talking about a rational argument, are we? Instead, the arguments you give is one from reason, that is, that your professor is trustworthy, because it makes more sense to believe this than to believe that he is lying. You might argue, for instance, that the subject he is teaching is from his own expertise. I could refute this by saying, since when is a professor absolutely infallible with regards to his own expertise? You might then argue that the university is paying him and evaluating him on his teaching practices. I could then refute this by saying, since when is a university absolutely infallible with regards to paying liars and evaluating cheaters? This can go on forever. My point is that your arguments are valid, not because they are rational, they certainly are not, but because they are reasonable. And in fact, each claim that is taken as reasonable makes the argument stronger, better. And just as with rational argumentation, there are two ways to argue reasonably, each with advantages and disadvantages which I have again listed. You can argue that your premises are reasonable, or you can counter-argue that your opponent's premises are unreasonable. There are several common ways in which arguments are confusing. Well-meaning debaters often destroy their argument, not because their argument is necessarily irrational or unreasonable, though it could be evidence of such a claim, but because the structure of their argument makes it necessarily self-contradict. This usually comes about by conflating, or combining, the various methods of argumentation. Two of the most common instances of confusing argumentation come from conflating an argument with a counter-argument, and conflating a rational argument with a reasonable argument. The former conflation is confusing because the debater is using two sets of premises, which necessarily contradict. An example might be an atheist who argues against the existence of absolute morality, while simultaneously arguing that atheists are more moral than Christian, which necessarily requires the existence of some type of absolute morality. Both arguments have merit separately, but when combined, the atheist argument appears irrational and contradictory. The second case of conflating a rational argument with a reasonable argument has a similar effect. To make reasonable arguments, the debater will employ qualified logical fallacies. However, this will appear contradictory if the debater is making the case that his argument is rational. An example might be a creationist who is rationally arguing the non-existence of transitional fossils, but then interjects a quote from Carl Sagan, or some other famous evolutionary scientist, that supports his argument. Both arguments have merit separately, but when combined, the creationist argument appears irrational, and thus contradictory. We must be careful so that our arguments do not appear to contradict themselves. This is the primary reason that we have studied argumentation, and learned to differentiate between the various methods of arguing. We want to avoid confusion, and to be as clear and concise as possible.